cannot hear me at all still. Is yours on? Alright, well, we'll wait till he gets back, I guess. Check, check, check.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at the Harris School of Public Policy. My name is Kat Jacob, and I'm a program associate here at the Center for Effective Government. The Center for Effective Government's mission is to study, debate, and enhance public understanding of reforms that have the potential to strengthen democratic institutions and improve the capacity of government to solve public problems. A big part of that work occurs through the Democracy Fellowship Program, which allows us to bring incredible practitioners to campus to share their insight on critical issues related to government effectiveness and the health of our democracy. Today, we're thrilled to have one of those fellows here, moderating tonight's discussion, Donald Sherman. And then over to you.
Can y'all, oh wow, that's really loud. Okay, so the mic works. Hello everyone, my name is Donald Sherman. I'm so pleased to be here at the University of Chicago, so pleased to be a Democracy Fellow for the Center for Effective Government. I am here as a Democracy Fellow, but also as the Executive Director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a nonpartisan nonprofit watchdog that promotes ethics and accountability, and has done so for the last 2 decades. This is the point in my introduction where I make a quick plug for Crew interns, for Crew fellows. We are hiring, and we would welcome all of the students here to apply. But I am so appreciative of the center for this opportunity, to Kat, to Sadia, to Professor Fowler, and the center's great work. I'm excited to be here today with a really extraordinary panel of experts, some of whom I have had the pleasure of working with at various points in my career, and some who I have just met. But we are here today to talk about the value of democracy and how democracy works or doesn't work for folks who are struggling with the everyday challenges of putting food on the table, ensuring the safety and security of their families. And as someone whose work focuses on ethics and accountability, I am primarily interested in what are the structures and reforms that exist or need to exist to ensure that we have an ethical and accountable government that works most effectively for Americans regardless of their income. And so I am pleased to moderate this discussion, and I want to start by introducing this extraordinary panel here with me today. So first, I want to introduce to my immediate left, Professor Molly Offer-Westort, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Chicago. She also has affiliations with the Department of Statistics, the Committee on Data Science, and the PhD program in political economy. Her work includes a substantive research program that examines online behavior to understand how people change their views and attitudes in response to the conversations they take part in and the information they engage with online. Her research has focused on effective public health dissemination and combating misinformation on social media platforms. And as someone who is really focused on how do we reach people to get them more invested in how government ethics impacts their lives, I'm especially interested in your perspective. To her left is Mark Roscoe, who previously served as the Attorney General and then Governor of the great state of Montana for 2 terms from 1993 to 2000. He is also a former chairman of the Republican National Committee under President George W. Bush. Since leaving government, Governor Roscoe has served on numerous nonprofit boards, and he has worked with Crew, my organization, on amicus briefs in support of our efforts to enforce the 14th Amendment's disqualification clause against Donald Trump. On the left of Governor Roscoe is Julian Castro, who currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the Latino Community Foundation, the nation's largest Latino-serving foundation. In 2014, he was appointed by President Obama as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development after serving as a council member and then mayor of the great city of San Antonio, Texas. I had the pleasure of working for Secretary Castro in the Obama administration, and I'm so pleased to have him here. In 2020, Secretary Castro ran for the Democratic nomination for president. So we have a panel that brings a range of experience, a range of public policy expertise, study, and implementation, and I'm so excited to have the three of you here with me. So to start, I want to level set for a second, and I want to start with you, Governor Roscoe. You know, as someone who is a government ethics lawyer, things feel pretty dire right now. You know, it often feels like the Constitution and government ethics are under siege. But one of the reasons why it's important and why I'm so appreciative to be here is because I think it's important for all of us to test our assumptions a little bit. And so, you know, I want to get a sense from you in the places and spaces where you are, you know, pretty far away from the DC Beltway. Is the threat to our Constitution and, in the end, to our democracy something that is real and urgent and resonates with your friends and neighbors?
Yes, yes, and yes. The bottom line is, I think that what I have witnessed over the course of the last few years is that, first of all, the Constitution, if you think about it for a moment, fundamentally is a document of consent. We all agree to promise one another that we will live by the virtues of the Constitution as well as its articulate and very precise commands. So it's delicate. You can't be ordered to have a Constitution. We have to choose it, and we have to promise that we will abide by it implicitly, typically not in written form, but nonetheless, that's the only way it's held together. So if you don't trust each other as a population, if you have no respect for one another, if there's no respect by office holders of the Constitution itself, if there's violations of the oath of office, which is very precise and demanded by the Constitution, then you can see that slowly the adhesive that holds the Constitution together, namely those civic virtues and our commitment to those virtues and to each other, begins to come under stress and strain. And in my observations, in my opinion, this is an incredibly urgent issue. And frankly, with what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. these days, with all due respect for good manners and proper etiquette, it's placed even more dangerously under fierce circumstances and opposition, violated daily. The oath is violated constantly. There's encroachment by one department upon another, by the administrations there presently. Just the way that business is conducted, the unlawful firing of people, the deportations that don't abide by the law, the defiance of court orders, that suggests to me that it is not far away from a crisis situation where you have a constitutional crisis, thereby calling into question whether or not we can live together in a democracy based upon freedom and liberty.
That's your reflection sounds like the voice in my head, and I think once we understand the threat, I think the next question is necessarily, why does it matter, right? What or how do you see the connection between a functioning ethical democracy and the daily economic, safety, and other challenges that that everyday Americans face on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think when you have an office holder that sets about to see what they can get away with rather than how it is that they can build trust and confidence so that a free people can distill policy and procedure and try to make certain that they keep focused on the public good, making our lives here something we treasure, preserving freedom because that freedom comes from those virtues that we all subscribe to and our adherence and loyalty to the Constitution. So it impacts virtually everything across the board. And just think about all of the people that now face fear and anxiety over deportations in the way and the manner and the method that's being employed. Think about all of those people that were involved in the insurrection, which was a violation of the Constitution, and for which the president was impeached. That impacted families with everything from death to injury. Think about everything that's taking place in terms of impacting people in the economy with these insane tariff plans that come one after another. It just goes on and on and on, and you know the list as well as I do. So the fact of the matter is, even though it may appear esoteric and somewhat removed from us, this engagement with the Constitution and how we need to embrace it and defend it on virtually every occasion, it's very close, it's very real. And what happens the day that Donald Trump defies another court order and a court sets about to impose process and there is nobody to serve the process because the United States Marshals work for the Department of Justice? That's how close we are to a catastrophe here and a constitutional crisis that gets completely out of control. So there are some people that think I'm a little bit of a Chicken Little running around talking about the sky falling. But after 77 years on the planet, about 30 or 40 years involved in political activity, and as a lawyer and a prosecutor and Army officer, in my view, we're closer to that possibility than we've ever been in the history of this 237-year-old democracy.
That is sobering. I'm sorry. I'm just catching my breath. Secretary Castro, you've worked at the local level. You've worked as a mayor. You've been in Washington as a cabinet secretary. Obviously, your brother is in Congress. And you ran for president with a People First campaign. How do you think about the impact of corruption and ethical issues in government, and how they impact the well-being of your friends and neighbors in San Antonio, and the people that you met across this country, as you were in political life?
Thanks, and thanks, Don, for the invitation to be here. It's always good to be at the University of Chicago. Thank you for having us. I think it affects people in so many different ways. Thinking about it in the local context, the national context. First, corruption. Once it becomes public. Of course, it can hurt people whether it's public or it's not public. A lot of corruption is never uncovered, but when it becomes public, it undermines people's confidence in our democracy. And what that translates into basically is less people actually going out and participating in the democracy. When I was growing up, I would always hear, people say, "Oh, they're all crooks." Right? Like, I was born in 1974, and so this was post-Watergate, and most people in modern times, they mark Watergate as sort of a seminal moment in the way that people saw at least the federal government, but I think it went much further than that. And when everybody thinks that that's the norm, that corruption is the norm, then it just depresses turnout at elections and their willingness to help make the choices of the distribution of resources, other policy choices that impact everything from education to housing to immigration to you name it. And so corruption has this this really decaying, damaging effect all the way through. In more specific ways, it also artificially creates winners and losers. From the, school board members that give contracts out to their friends, to no bid contracts at the state level from time to time that are uncovered, to other types of corruption, to the benefit that individual office holders get from it, right? Particular ones that engage in the corruption. It artificially sets who gets ahead and who doesn't. And then I would say just a third way is that it undermines certainty that you need in a well-functioning economy, right? Businesses need a certain amount of certainty. So, I'm Mexican-American. My grandmother came over from Mexico, and when I was growing up, you would always hear about Mexico. And I think it's gotten better, but I'm sure it still exists, that, if you get stopped on the street, like pay the cop $20, right? And, or if, now I'll use an example from our country and cities. You often hear stories of, for instance, building inspectors, right, or others. I don't want to pick on the building inspector corps of the United States, but I would hear that in local government, more often than other positions. Of, if you want to pass your inspection, whatever. So, but it undermines certainty, right, to have a system that is corrupt, that is fundamentally unfair. And you just multiply that out, and it has a bigger effect than I think any one transaction of corruption does over time.
That's really helpful to understand more tangible examples and more, and sort of bringing the concept of corruption to the local level, right? To understand how it impacts issues that that folks can touch and feel on a daily basis. Professor, what does your research and experience tell us about how people are experiencing our democracy, or at the very least, what is influencing their opinions about whether democracy is working for them or not?
Yeah, thank you so much for coordinating this panel and for inviting me to participate, and thank you to the other participants for coming out as well. So I study online behavior and how people engage with information online. And I do want to say, I'm going to take a cross-national perspective on this question, and that a lot of the work that I do is outside the United States. But I think something that's changed in political science over the past couple of years has been that scholars of American politics have increasingly found that they have a lot to learn from other contexts, other countries studied comparatively. And while there are a lot of specifics that are special in this US case, I think the United States is being seen, there's increasing recognition that the US is not so much a special case, but that there is a lot that we can learn from the study of other countries that have previously experienced democratic erosion. And so we do see in the United States that people are very skeptical of democracy right now. And this is something that's been increasing over time, over at least the last 2 administrations. There was a Pew study that was done last summer where 72% of Americans said that they thought that the United States had previously been a good model of democracy, but no longer is. And that's a very high number prior to the start of this current administration. So that distrust in democracy has been increasing in the United States over time, but this is also part of a global trend. And I do think the economy is part of what's going on. There are people in rich democracies are unhappy with their democracies globally right now, according to Pew Research. And the more that people distrust, or the more that people are unhappy with their economies, the more likely they are also to be unsatisfied with their democracy at this point in time. So there is something going on there that where people think that their opportunities are being curtailed, or they think that there is unfairness in how resources are being allocated. They're distrusting not just of politicians, but of the institutions that are in place in their countries as well. However, I think it is also not obvious the direction that that causal arrow is going. So we know that from political science research, partisans have better perceptions of the economy when their party is in power. And in the United States, that partisan perception gap has also been increasing over time. So it's not just a question of the state of the economy, but we're seeing changes in how people view the economy and differences in how people view the economy and what they're experiencing there. And this is where I'm going to bring it back to my research on social media, is that I think we've seen a lot of changes in how people get information and fragmentation of their information environments that's really driving a lot of this, that people are being exposed to different types of narratives and just have different understandings of the way that the world works. Maybe I'll leave it there for this question and pick it up in some of the future questions to discuss.
Well, I have a number of
Yeah.
follow-up questions for you. But it sounds like what you're saying is that one of the results of the high level of consumption of news on social media platforms has led to sort of an informational siloing, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So when we talk about how people are engaging with information on social media, we talk about filter bubbles and echo chambers. And the idea is basically that as you're existing on the internet, platforms are creating a profile about you, and that profile is informing the information you see, the types of social media posts that you're shown, and you end up just getting very different perspectives of the world, that people are more likely to be served narratives that are palatable to their worldviews. One of the things that's happening as we're also seeing fragmentation of digital media environments is that people have different media narratives that they're seeing, and they're also aware of these misinformation campaigns that can happen. And so as a misinformation researcher, I think what misinformation research is showing us is not necessarily that people are seeing a large volume of misinformation online, but because of these fragmented information environments and people's knowledge of these misinformation campaigns, there's a lot of information uncertainty. And so this information uncertainty is a general distrust of the media and general distrust of information that people see online. This is not kind of like a healthy skepticism that is driving people to engage more. It's making people distrustful even of reputable news platforms. It's making people lose the heuristics that they might otherwise have used to navigate complex information environments, which is what people are existing in now, where they have access to effectively limitless information. Navigating that is very, very hard. And so people are generally mistrusting, and that distrust of the media is being translated also into distrust of institutions in general.
Governor Roscoe, I want to come back to you because in the, before we came out here, we were talking about some of your travels across Montana. And it seems like one of the ways to better reach people is, people say this and it's become a cliche, but literally to meet them where they are. And you were talking a little bit about your experience doing that in the last several months. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those travels, what you've taken away from them, and and what are the most significant concerns that you have heard about sort of the lawlessness and corruption that has, that the administration has pushed in the last few months?
Well, I think to have this discussion, it's a very large question, by the way, because it involves a lot of different operating dynamics. But to have this discussion, I think as well, that we have to realize there are a number of underlying explanations that contribute to the situation we're in. For instance, in the state of Montana, the educational process has no longer stipulated in our rules and regulations that you offer courses in American history and in civics. And as a consequence of that, we were, having been exposed to that, we knew a great deal more than young people today know. Secondly, there's a drastically different economy that's out there and a lot of disenfranchised people. A lot of, this might sound a bit controversial, but there's a young white male issue in this country that is fed by and created by differences and changes in the institutions that create jobs, that produce opportunities. The unions have been diminished. There are a lot of circumstances like this that contribute to the lack of knowledge and understanding and interest even in the Constitution of the United States of America. So we start there, and when we talk about skepticism, I think, frankly, you also have to attribute part of it to the fact that they don't know what, in fact, is contained within the Constitution. In addition to that, I don't think they understand exactly what it is that we have as options. I mean, over the last 2,500 years, the human race has gone through virtually every form of government that the human mind can imagine. And every single one of them has failed at one point in time or another. So if we fail at democracy, our only choice is the law of the jungle, because there's nothing that's really worked all that well in the past. And I know that probably there are some who view that with some skepticism, saying that, but I frankly think that that's what we're on the cusp of. What I've noticed is that I started about 3 years ago. It all started with me, honestly, when, having been the chair of the Republican Party, I don't think I was probably ever a really good political operative to begin with. My mother was a good Republican from Chicago, I might add. My dad was a strong Franklin Roosevelt Democrat, so I grew up in a mixed marriage. And frankly, they didn't talk about politics a lot. They talked about issues a lot, but they never really tested each other on the basis of their political beliefs. They weren't identified as human beings by whether they were a Democrat or a Republican. So as a consequence of that, I never ascribed a great deal of notoriety or credibility to it. And I was involved in the Army, and after that with prosecution for 25 years, and in the Attorney General's office. So again, even though that involved some sheriffs that were Democrats and some that were Republicans, I didn't know what one sheriff was or another. And in addition to that, I found the operation of political committees to be somewhat disdainful, frankly. They tended to decide who it was that was going to get money for their campaigns, which surrogates would go out and testify on behalf of the candidates. They would get together as this little cabal that would govern the party, and they'd choose the candidates who were going to be supported. And then you combine that with partisan elections, where you have these screens that keep so many people out of the electoral process. So you end up with this volatile mixture, and I'm sorry to be so broad-based in this answer to your question, but at the end of the day, we haven't paid attention as a population, and we haven't focused upon how beautiful and what a miracle this democracy is. And I don't think we've really come to grips with how much we have to work at it. You know, the guy that invented it was a Frenchman. And at the end of the day, he said, you know, for it to work, you have to love it. And I don't think yet we have the spirit of democracy across the land that allows for us to depend on it like we did for so long. I mean, I'm 77 years old, and I can remember thinking in the 50s and the 60s that life was unfolding as it should. There was a certain rhythm, a certain amount of stability that you depended on. And now everything is in upheaval day after day after day. So I think that's a reflection of how we have lost our bearings somewhat. We're not aware of how delicate the Constitution is. We don't set about to enforce it. We see candidates, and especially one at the top of the ticket, who violates the Constitution every day. And not only just the terms of the Constitution, but the law as well, and ethics as well. And so that sends a signal. And most of the people in the United States of America are really nice people. And they don't complain a lot, most of them. And they don't go about criticizing. I mean, it's uncomfortable for me to be, pretty searing in my scrutiny of what the hell's going on in the United States of America. But I don't see any other solution other than coming to grips with an honest assessment. Now, what I've seen is this. When I first was invited to come out and talk about these issues, I did so with reluctance. And I thought, this is a huge topic. And as a consequence of that, what difference can I make? You know, I'm just one little small voice up in the northwest corner of the state of Montana. What in the name of God can I contribute to this effort? But I've found over the course of time that there's growing concern. And all of you here are tonight probably because you have some growing concern. And because you know in your hearts that things just aren't right. And that the rhythm that we have experienced in the past, I mean, take a look at it. When you think about it, we look at the Congress and we had Mike Mansfield and Everett Dirksen, a Democrat and Republican, majority leader, minority leader. What did they do? Quickly, they passed the Civil Rights Bill. They passed the first treaty, nuclear treaty. They passed the Voting Rights Bill. They navigated us through the '68 Democratic Convention. They navigated us through the resignation of Richard Nixon. All huge. And the death of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy. It was a hellacious period of time, so disruptive. And they steered us through that with steady, unselfish, humble, contrite, thoughtful deliberation and cooperation. They never cared about whether they were Democrats or Republicans. So we flipped. We flipped away. And how far we slip is up to you, just like it's up to me. And how vigorously we work. I mean, Donald works every day looking at these questions, writing briefs and advising people in positions of authority and setting an example with the organization he runs. And so they're doing something every single day that they have waking moments to be able to accomplish that. And I didn't see that among the people that I live with in the state of Montana. It was kind of like, yeah, oh yeah, the Constitution, nice thing, great document. It's changed over the course of the last 3 years. Thank God. It's not near fast enough. And I hope we get to all of those changes before we reach catastrophe. You know, we've had disaster before. Civil War was a disaster. We've had other disasters after that. And we do really well when there are disasters. But we don't do so well as a human race in anticipating and trying to prevent difficulty. And so what I've been trying to do is convince people to get focused and demonstrate your love and affection for this Constitution and our way of life and bring those virtues to it. Compassion, thoughtfulness, moderation, self-restraint, trust in each other. You can't have a democracy if you don't have trust. Who's going to trust you to do anything? So that's what I've been preaching. You can see fairly forcefully. And what I've noticed is this. When I first started, I went to a little town, happened to be where I was born. There aren't many people there, maybe 4,000 people in the county. And they wanted to talk. It was a Democratic meeting, and I'm allegedly a Republican, even though I'd already come out against Trump in 2016, for which there was great disdain. But I made the judgment about that, by the way, upon a hierarchy of values that says the country's first. And then if it happens to coincide with a political party platform, great. If it doesn't, the country's still first. And that's how it has to be with all of us. That's what the Constitution says. It's first. And so I went to this meeting. I know I'm way too long here, so I'll quickly come. There were 50 people there. 2 weeks later, they invited me back up to the same area, a smaller town. I thought, you know, I'm going any place I can go where 2 or 3 people will stand still long enough for me to talk. And so I went. There were 150 people there that night. So I went to another one with another group, Democrat, Republican, Independent, all 3 of us, not caring what anybody thought. What we were focused on is our country. And there were 200 people there. So over the course of time, you know, Bernie Sanders and AOC came to Montana and a number of other western states. They saw over 200,000 people came to their gatherings, 9,000 in Montana. And our crowds have been getting bigger, from 350 to 500 to 700. I was in Boise last week. There were 800. So it's starting. And that's the only way we can deal with this issue. You know, we tried, Donald and I tried our best to disqualify. He was disqualified by law. He should have never been a candidate, but the court didn't agree. And we could argue that for a long time. We have. I have. But it didn't happen. They missed on the impeachment because they couldn't find enough courage to do the right thing for the right reasons. So we let this problem fester now almost for 10 years. And what do we have left? Just what Benjamin Franklin says we had left. You have a republic if you can keep it. So my message to you tonight is, you got to keep it. We all have to keep it. And we all have to get working at it. And we have to disapprove when it's not right. And we have to exhort when it is right. And we have to make sure our representatives are accountable. I mean, they don't control this country. This guy doesn't own the government. He owns nothing of the government. At the end of the day, that's what I think you wanted me in a much shorter fashion. I'm sorry. I
appreciate that.
I get a little bit wired up, but
and perspective. Let me bring the secretary into the conversation. Because one of the things that the governor touched upon was the barriers to entry for people who want to pursue public service to do so. And obviously you ran for president, your brother is in Congress right now, and I imagine he still spends quite a lot of time on the phone, calling donors and raising money for the next race. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you experience and that you see in our campaign finance system, how that informs what our government looks like, and then what our government can do once folks are actually in office?
Yeah, so let me tell just really quickly how my brother and I got into it, and then use a couple of examples along the way of that I think answer your question. I ran for city council when I was 26 years old and got elected in San Antonio, Texas, and represented about 125,000 people. And then I lost a close mayor's race when I was 30, and then got elected 4 years later. My brother got elected when he was 28 to the state house in Texas, and then a few years later got elected to Congress. He's actually been at it now for 23 years, I think. This is his 23rd year. I was in and out, so he has a little bit more gray hair than I do. So, but a really good example, two good examples from my city council days. San Antonio, and this is not unique to San Antonio, used to have a charter that only paid city council members $20 per meeting. And the most that you could make was $1,040 a year. That charter was from 1951, and basically it was created, when you had this good old boys club that ran the city. Before single-member districts were implemented, and before the civil rights movement and all of that stuff. And at the same time, when I started, there were no campaign finance limits. And in the state of Texas, at the state level, there are still no campaign finance limits. It's unlimited. Greg Abbott has gotten, I think, a $3 million contribution. And I don't mean to a PAC or dark money, I mean directly to the campaign.
Oh.
$1 million, I know for sure $1 million contribution, but I think I remember a $3 million contribution. And so, what you have is different pieces of a system that encourage or discourage people from running and make it difficult for people. In the case, my city council example, right, what it did was it meant that you had to either have somebody else that you could rely on for income, or be retired and collecting your retirement, some arrangement so that you could run for city council in the first place. The result was that women were very underrepresented over the years. In fact, we only had one female mayor. Now, of course, there are different reasons for that, right? But but one of them I think had to do with the way that council members were compensated. And then in addition to that, what I noticed over the years was, and this goes to the campaign finance wherever you find it, at every level, is that you get into a bubble where you over-listen to the people that are big contributors to your campaign. That happens at every level. People over-listen, policymakers over-listen, elected officials, to those people. Because they know that on the other side of that is, okay, are they going to make a significant contribution, or are they going to bundle money, are they going to raise money, right? Ironically, the higher you go, there's more pressure on that because you have bigger bundlers that mean more and more to campaigns. And then also, in a way, there's a release valve because now, if you're running for president or you're running in a high-profile Senate campaign or maybe a gubernatorial race, the emergence of small dollar contributions, Act Blue on the Democratic side, for instance, means that you can start racking up a lot more money more quickly now in this day and age, right, than you used to be able to. If you're in a high-profile race, I'll give you an example out of Texas, Beto O'Rourke running against Ted Cruz, right, in 2018. Or Colin Allred last time running against Ted Cruz. Or John Ossoff and Warnock running, in 2020, early 21. But outside of that, those old rules still apply, that we have a campaign finance system that basically puts a lot more power into the hands of people that can give and especially that can raise a lot of money for candidates. That has, I think, a corruptive effect down the line in who ends up running for office, in who gets elected, certainly, in what they pay attention to, and the issues that they choose to speak out on or not speak out on, and so forth. And then finally, let me give you an example of how I think all of that ties into policy in a very specific way, and I'll take housing, my own neck of the woods, as an example in a non-obvious way. I remember that in San Antonio, in zoning notification, if somebody wanted a zoning change, right? Like let's say I want to change this plot of land from single-family zoning to multifamily zoning, right? Because I want to build an office building, let's say, or multifamily housing. You have to notify people, you have to notify property owners within a certain radius that you want to make that change, right? The property owners. You don't have to notify individual tenants or residents. You have to notify just the property owners. So that means people that live in a multifamily building oftentimes would not get a notification. The property owner of that multifamily building would. I offer that in the context of our conversation to say that ingrained in the way that governments do business, both in terms of campaign finance and then even like mundane stuff like zoning policy, so a zoning notification policy, is that it's basically making it easier or harder for people to both be democratically engaged, to run for office, to get elected, and to either be responsive or non-responsive. And basically, the poorer you are as a resident of the country or citizen of the country, the less likely you are to actually get the attention and I think the thoughtfulness of elected officials generally that represent you. So.
Thank you for that. And one of the interesting things that has come from the conversations that I've been having with students today is there is a need for a more engaged, more active public. We need to invest in citizens and civics, but being engaged, an engaged citizen is not without costs. And in addition to the barriers to entry for people to enter public life as an elected official, there are barriers to entry facing folks who want to be engaged citizens, but there just aren't enough hours in the day to, track city council hearings, to respond to zoning notices. And these are, among the sort of systemic challenges that we see in how we as advocates and people in government reach the people that they are meant to serve. Professor, I wanted to ask you a question of a slightly different vein, because, one of the unique challenges of my work is that I am continually focused on exposing government corruption, on addressing the sort of biggest threats to ethics and accountability. But I often worry that it creates its own misinformation problem, where there are millions of folks who go into public service, who do a good job, who serve the public honorably and ably and ethically, but nobody writes stories about the person that goes to, the civil servants that go to HUD and, work every day and do a good job and go home and retire after 30 years, right?
Well,
Like
these days they get fired.
Right. These and particularly, right, in an environment where public service is being denigrated, public, civil servants are being fired illegally. I guess, do you have a concern, or should I have a concern, I guess, that highlighting these examples of government corruption can contribute to undermining public trust and create this sort of, its own sort of misinformation problem in how people see their government and thus how they engage with it?
I was afraid you were going to ask this question because my answer is going to be yes, you should be worried, and I don't have a solution. But
I asked the question because I wanted to know what you think.
I absolutely think this is a very meaningful concern because, as I said before, what we're seeing as researchers of misinformation right now is that there are targeted disinformation campaigns, but as a whole, people are not seeing a large volume of misinformation. However, what people are seeing is misleading headlines that might be technically true or stories that include partial information. And this is so tricky for figuring out how to navigate this. This is a slightly different than your issue, but it's so difficult to figure out how to navigate this in online spaces because if you have a story that is misleading but technically true, should that be flagged by a platform? Should that exist online? What's the intervention that should happen? But with these types of stories where you're shining a light on corruption, this should definitely happen. But people are navigating these complicated information environments. How do they think about that piece of information kind of more holistically within the entire system? And I worry about it because in my own work in Kenya and Nigeria, and particularly looking at disseminating COVID vaccines at a time when COVID vaccines were free and widely available, we were trying to understand why there was still a lot of vaccine hesitancy and people weren't getting vaccinated. And two of the main reasons were distrust in institutions and information uncertainty. So people were hearing different stories, they didn't really know it was true, they didn't know how to figure out what was true and what was not true, and they just had a lot of different information that they were navigating. We were able to address this through giving people really targeted messaging to address their concerns. But I think in your situation, where you're trying to shine a light on the corruption but get people to understand the larger context, I think one way to think about this is framing these stories in larger narratives around how there can be institutional checks, how government bodies are able to self-regulate in certain ways, and helping people to understand the processes. A lot of what I think might be helpful in terms of getting people to gain trust in institutions is improving understanding of processes and getting people to engage critically with these processes. So if there's a way to write a story, right, that's about we brought up this corruption, and the reason that we're able to find this story, highlight this story, is because actually some of these processes are working. We have a whistleblower, we're able to do a FOIA request. You know, this is what is bringing this to light, and so people can understand that process. I at least would hope that that helps people to understand that this is not just another bad story, but you're able to kind of show what's happening to help make democracy better through these types of interventions.
I really appreciate that. And I did not have any illusions about what you're about the answer to your question, but it's important to ask because it is a thing that I wrestle with on a daily basis. How do you tell the story of the millions of unseen people who go into government for the right reasons, do the right thing, get little credit, but also sound the alarm that Governor Roscoe has been ringing about, the threat of corruption by the executive, by the president, or systemic corruption, as Secretary Castro alluded to, and the threat that it poses to democracy. So I want to spend a couple of minutes on questions from the audience, and so I will start with a question for Governor Roscoe. So you spent a lot of time talking about engaging with your friends and neighbors in Montana. One question from the audience was, when you talk to Republicans who supported President Trump, do they still feel represented by him 100 days in? Do they have a reaction to to the last 100 days? I mean, one of the interesting things you mentioned backstage was the cuts on the Forest Service. So I thought that was an interesting and sort of salient example. But curious if you have others.
Well, I haven't. I can't confess to having had a conversation precisely about whether or not those who voted, and he got a healthy vote in the state of Montana, still remain loyal. But my guess would be that because they are experiencing catastrophe, which tends to galvanize a sentiment and people together when they're going through disaster at the same time and experiencing the same things. So I really can't answer the question about whether they still adhere to their choice to begin with. And I might not have been the one that they contemplated talking to in the first place. But to be honest with you, even though I was involved for a long time in Republican Party politics and was the titular head of the party for a while in D.C., no one has really confronted me or assaulted me in any way whatsoever. They may not bring up topics of concern, but they haven't confronted me. My belief is that there's really a lot more people out there than what we think sometimes, who are just good, decent, thoughtful people who have let the person that's appealing to them appeal to their worst side of human nature. And in times of peril and fear and anxiety, autocrats make a great deal of progress because they make everybody feel better with simple solutions that never work. And I mean, take a look at tariffs, for instance. That's been a real prize. It's obviously been a matter of great success and benefited everybody. And when you take a look at the farmers and ranchers in Montana, the Agriculture Department now is reporting about food shortages that are going to hit the country. They have grains that they need to sell in Montana, and some of them have consigned them already. They're sitting on ships and rail cars across the United States of America. We have BLM lands, we have the national parks, we have dams all over the place that are run by the Corps of Engineers. We have forest firefighters who are Department of Ag employees. A lot of them, and we have a huge number of veterans. We have the highest percentage of veterans, I believe, in the United States of America on a per capita basis. And so all of those different spheres of influence have been hit. And so you can see, I think, when you are personally engaged and you are personally in the crosshairs of somebody's onslaught, that you're going to react differently. Now that's what I was talking about earlier a little bit, is we do really well in disaster, taking care of each other. We do pitifully poor in terms of anticipating it. And I think the race here is this, that we need to get enough people galvanized to do things before we have this crisis with our Constitution. Because once you start disobeying court orders, and the U.S. Marshals work for the president, and you can't service process, those are explosive situations. So I think that they're recognizing, and when it hits them personally, it's obviously profound. So I don't think they're as inclined to talk to me about whether or not their once favorite politician remains so.
I want to come back to that in a second, sort of making it personal. But, Mr. Secretary, one of the things that the governor mentioned was how government works or it doesn't work. And you know, you're someone who has the vantage point of working very closely with making government work at the local level, and then obviously in the executive branch. And so I'm curious, from your various perspectives, what are some of the ways that government can directly deliver for voters and build more faith and trust among the public more broadly that government is working for them, that democracy is working for them?
I think in different ways. Number one, by doing a better job of listening to them. One of the things I'm most proud of that we did in San Antonio was something called SA 2020, which is basically a visioning process that asked the community to participate in dreaming about the next 10 years. And over the course of 6 months, thousands of San Antonians came to 6 different forums, thousands in all came to 6 different forums, aimed at setting goals on 75 different measures, like specific numeric goals, and then setting a general vision for the future. And then it was our task in the city government to pursue those goals. We kicked the process off on Saturday, September 25th, 2010, and the question that we opened with was, what kind of city do we want to be on Friday, September 20th, or 25th, 2020. So by listening better, I think by doing everything that it can to actually deliver on promises, right? You know, ironically, for some people, that's where Trump is getting ahead right now. How many times have y'all heard, like, over these last couple of months, well, that's what he said he was going to do, right? Like that he promised this and now that's what he's doing. Never mind that, you know, in my personal opinion, he lied about a whole bunch of stuff, right? In fact, many of these cuts he never said he was going to make to a whole bunch of really important programs. But to me, that's always been a reflection of the cynicism that so many people have that their government institutions do not, and by extent to the politicians that are in charge of the direction of them, don't deliver on the promises. So at every level, from the school board level, the local level, the state level, obviously the federal level, you have to find ways to be able to deliver and deliver meaningful, impactful action. That's why I think, you know, when we look back at it, the FDR years, the LBJ years for Democrats were so impactful because of all of those programs that were delivered and created that changed people's lives, you know. And you know, we worked on one of those with the Fair Housing Act, right, and all of the opportunity, or with the FHA, right? Just so that people can measure that, feel that in their lives. And I also think that, to the professor's point, like there has to be in this day and age where it's not just 3 big networks anymore that people are getting their news from, much better ways of putting a punctuation mark on that and explaining the how on the many times where promises are delivered, right? Whether it's a pothole that's fixed or at the state level, you don't have to wait as long in the DMV line anymore, right? Or at the federal level, the massive amount of student loan debt forgiveness that the Biden administration did accomplish, which was historic. A much better job of that being able to be communicated and that really being understood and two being put together by the public. And I don't think that there's any, magic formula for that. But in this day and age with such fractured media, with a lot of misinformation and disinformation, it just takes that much more of a concerted effort and people being on the same page to try and deliver it and trying to rehabilitate some of these platforms and media that deliver it. Finally, just really quickly to the question that you asked a little bit earlier on the regret factor for people on Trump. I lead the Latino Community Foundation, and just yesterday, in conjunction with Voto Latino, we released a poll of Latinas and Latinos 100 days in to the Trump administration, a nationwide poll of 1,000 respondents across a series of issues. But one of the things that it found was that, at least with regard to the Latino community, that 7% of the people who actually voted for him now basically express regret for doing that, which you can take as either small or, 7% as a politician, if 7% of the people that supported you leave you in very close elections, that's a lot, right? So our poll was different from most of the polls that you see out there right now, because it was a poll of only people who had voted in the 24 election. So these were people who actually voted for him in the election or said they did, and 7% are saying that they regret it.
So I'm going to blame the secretary for this, but Molly, I'm going to ask you what may be an unfair question, which is, for folks who are in government, who are working to make the case for why, government as a whole or the institutions that they work in are delivering, or for folks like me who are in the policy advocacy community, working to make the case for democratic institutions, small d, democratic institutions, delivering for folks. How are there some strategies, or frankly, policy changes, either one, right? User strategies or policy recommendations for how we can better communicate in a increasingly partisan and polarized media environment that includes, legacy media, but also includes misinformation and disinformation as well.
So I don't think I have a straightforward answer or an easy answer, but I do think one of the pathways speaks to something that the secretary just said about listening to people, is that in the studies that I have worked on, where we have tried to encourage people with public policy, with government programming, the interventions that have been more effective are the ones that critically engage people. So my research has looked at testing out a number of different interventions, but we've looked at things like engaging people in question and answer format, giving really targeted information based on concerns that people had communicated to us or questions that they had communicated to us. So really responding personally, looking at improving people's digital literacy so they have the tools to more critically engage themselves. But all of these things are part of like a back and forth conversation where we're seeing the communication as something that we're doing with people rather than to people, right? That if you're looking at a public health programming, that's something that you're doing with a population, not to a population. And I think that that might be where some possibilities lay, that if you can understand what people's concerns are and you can have a conversation with them, try and address those concerns, try and get them to be able to themselves navigate some of this information and understand processes, I think that might be one pathway. I do think that each of these kind of problems that we're trying to address is so specific, and so it takes a lot of work to be able to do that listening well and to be able to understand the context, to see where people are coming from, to see what narratives they're getting and what their concerns are. But I do think that that discursive approach is what I am most optimistic about.
So that sort of begs the question, back to you, Mr. Secretary, and then to Governor Roscoe. When you embarked on the 2020 project, how did you prepare to listen, right? Like, how did you prepare to get the inputs? How did you work to make sure that you could reach enough people to feel like your community was being heard?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we did it by setting up a steering committee to begin with, a steering committee of people from different walks of life, folks who had been active at City Hall and some people that hadn't. We did it through a facilitated process with a group called JCCI out of Jacksonville that had experience facilitating these kind of community engagements. We did it by moving the site of the physical meetings around to different parts of town and doing translation as well there, and then advertising it in English and Spanish, offering different ways, including digitally, to take in information, but also over the phone, and then at the meetings. We did it by recording, and then video recording and stuff, and then also like having people there, like physically kind of writing, taking notes. And by messaging that we wanted people to tell us, a constant messaging of we were there to listen and that this was their plan. Because I'm convinced that you can accomplish a lot more, and it's a lot more doable at the local level, but you can accomplish a lot more if people believe that it's the community's plan and that it's not one politician's plan or a city council's plan, right? And so those were some of the ways that we did that, of just being open and setting an example of listening, making it available to different areas, neighborhoods, and walks of life, and then through a promise also that I think gave confidence to people that we were going to be transparent and report out every year, which was done, where we were on each of those metrics. So then there was a final report that was released after the September 25th, 2020 date on what had been accomplished, where we had sort of, we didn't hit the mark, but we were kind of in the range, and then some where we went backward, some where you really, you could tell you just did not make the progress that you wanted to make. But I think that gave people confidence. And that process was instrumental in us passing something called Pre-K for SA, which was a ballot initiative to raise the sales tax by 1/8 of a cent to fund high-quality full-day pre-K for 22,000 4-year-olds in the city over 8 years, and then that was re-upped, passed in 2012, re-upped in 2020, and it'll be up again in 2028. People feel like this is what we wanted. And I would just use that as an example also of another way that I think that governments can gain confidence is if you use the ballot and initiative process in a constructive way, because there are also many destructive ways that we've seen it used, but in a constructive way, the community can feel like this, we own this is ours. And then if you implement it well, you kind of go full circle on that.
Well, I think one thing that you said that really stuck with me and will continue to is transparency is important even when you fall short. And right now we are engaged in litigation against Doge to bring its operations into the light. And the administration is fighting us tooth and nail in court. We are headed to discovery, in the coming weeks there. And then we also sued the Center for Disease Control because they fired everybody in their FOIA shop. And so now they can't produce documents pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act at a time where, as I'm sure you know, in Texas, measles, incidences are increasing, and there's a growing public health crisis, and the immediate response from the administration is to operate in secrecy, but particularly in a crisis, that does not build confidence, and it's one of the reasons why we continue to push in court for transparency. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and so maybe what I will do is sort of give each of you a minute for last thoughts. I would love a real minute for last thoughts. I am certainly interested in if there are policies or reforms that you think would be meaningful or could have been meaningful, but I will let you take the minute in whatever way you think makes the most sense. So I will start with Molly, then go to the governor, then go to Secretary Castro.
So I would love to hear if you have policy recommendations for the secretary and the governor. But I think where I want to start is saying that as a political scientist, I think many other political scientists will tell you that a lot of the challenges that we have in constitutional crises are due not necessarily to institutional failures, but erosion of norms, right? It's not necessarily that some mechanism didn't work, but that there was an erosion of norms such that there was an actor or actors who were willing to violate those democratic norms, and we have seen the downstream consequences, or we could see the downstream consequences. And so I want to emphasize that public opinion is so important, public engagement and public pressure, and I think that being able to have free and open conversations is so important, and we're doing this here in a university setting. And so I will hope that universities like this institution and other institutions will stand up against the current attack on the independence of universities to be able to have these difficult, contested conversations that are such an important part of the democratic process, even if that is painful for the institutions and painful for researchers like me who benefit from federal funding.
Thank you. Governor?
Well, I would second the professor's notions and thoughts about how to confront some of these issues. I think at the same time that we have to recognize the dangerous game that's being carried out here in Washington, D.C. And we also, I think, need to communicate to those who are making those decisions presently and to inspire the people we live with around us about the fact that government does, in fact, have a mission of compassion that is legitimate and thoughtful and careful and directed and produces positive practical results. And that when you take a look at the efforts of the Bush White House to deal with HIV with PEPFAR, and over the course of these last years has saved 26 million lives, how you can say that's not a part of your core competency, I just cannot fathom. And frankly, as a practical matter, if you can't see it in that light, even if you have no sense of compassion, at the end of the day, it exports democracy. And it enlivens our democracy, it protects our democracy because we're taking care of issues before they become so desperate that people rebel and create circumstances of violence. So they are so misdirected and so much inclined toward this blitzkrieg that they imposed in the first place without any kind of cause or reason or understanding or intuition. They fed the, keywords into AI computer programs, and any place that appeared in the bureaucracy, they simply started firing people. That's a violation of the Constitution every single day, and it's a violation of decency. And as a consequence of that, we should be emotionally elevated about these things and talk about them precisely, and try to convince our neighbors to do the same.
Thank you, Governor. Secretary Castro?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having us here. Yeah, I mean, I think probably there would be a lot of agreement on some things that are usually the policies that we say would help, right? Like overcoming Citizens United, I think that was a terrible decision. Finding ways to rein in the influence of big money, of dark money, and both by limiting it and also uplifting people that don't have the means, the voices of people that don't have the means to donate $1,000 or $3,300, whatever the limit is right now. My brother would know, I don't. Right? Is it $3,300, Donald?
I think that's right.
Public financing, for instance. I wish that we had a more robust public financing system in the United States, stronger ethics codes, and adherence to the ethics codes, and then also just the pipeline of people to continue into public service. Like, I'm very worried about this period. I'll just say extremely briefly, very worried about this period because I think a lot of people are being repelled from getting into public service by all of this mess. And it's the good people that you want that will have integrity, that are in it for the right reasons, that are going to say, like, that's just, it's too nasty, too polarized, too everything. So I hope anything that we can do to support nonprofits out there and others that are, I think of things like Run for Something and Indivisible and others that are producing pipeline of people that want to run for office and would have integrity in doing it.
Good points.
So I want to thank our panelists for just this great conversation about ethics and corruption and how to make our democracy work for a wider set of the American public. I want to thank everyone here for their attentiveness and for the great questions. And I want to thank the Center for Effective Government for the opportunity to bring us all together. My hope is that this conversation will not be the last one that is had about these issues, that you will take this conversation and take it to the tables and communities where you are. I will certainly take this conversation back with me to Washington and to the other places in the country where I travel as part of my work. And I would just ask that you all give our panelists a round of applause.